Welcome back, traders and investors, to Benzinga's Pre-Market Prep, brought to you by Benzinga Pro. I'm your co-host, Joel L. Conan, along with Spencer Israel, and we have Jeff Johnston on the line. He's the Managing Director and Wireless Analyst at Detwiler. Jeff, how you doing on this Apple Wednesday?
I'm doing great, guys. Good morning to you, and thanks for having me on the show.
No, it's a pleasure. We'd love to get your input here on the Apple earnings here. Just off the cuff, your first response to the report.
Well, this was something that we were concerned about back in October, September timeframe. We were warning investors that, we thought that the December quarter was going to be okay because Apple was benefiting from, channel fill as well as a full quarter selling into China. So we thought the prospects of them growing iPhone sales in the December quarter on a year-over-year basis was probably a pretty safe bet. But our bigger concern was the guide heading into the March quarter in light of the research that we were doing back in that sort of September, October timeframe where, it sounded like pre-order volumes weren't as strong as they were with the iPhone 6 cycle. And, the incremental feature sets on the phone, I would characterize them more as sort of evolutionary versus revolutionary. And we just didn't really think that was going to have a meaningful impact on the upgrade cycle. So we thought, again, things were probably going to play out okay for the December quarter, but it was the March quarter when they wouldn't benefit from channel fill and what certainly seemed like a softening demand environment. We thought that would begin to play out in March. So, again, that was sort of our concern, and it seemed to play out last night.
How do you conduct that kind of research, like the pre-phone sales and stuff like that? Do you get the information from the company itself? Do you have some special, investigative tactics, or you don't have to reveal all your strategies? But how do you get about that information?
Look, we use the mosaic theory when we're doing our research. So we're talking to a number of people in the supply chain to kind of piece things together and come up with our investment thesis. So it's it's kind of roll up the sleeves and get a little dirty, if you will, and try and figure things out.
All right, so I guess you would agree with the pundits to say that Apple, the catalysts are a bit stale here.
Yeah, I'll tell you. I think as we think about the next few quarters, the challenge, of course, is going to be the backdrop of, again, what we see in developed markets where we think that demand is softening a little bit. Saturation is definitely playing a role in this, despite the fact that the company is trying to change the narrative a little bit more and talk about currency headwinds and a lot of markets where they're selling into that are dependent on commodities, and those prices have fallen. So, people don't have the currency to be able to go out and buy a new iPhone. And I think that's probably having, some kind of an impact on it. But even if we look at in the U.S., for example, where, we're not clearly exposed to currency headwinds and we're not as exposed to falling commodity prices, if you look at Verizon, for example, in the December quarter, their overall handset sales were down about 13-14% on a year-over-year basis. And they're talking about no growth this year in the smartphone market, at least for Verizon. So you've got a lot of these headwinds in emerging markets that are going to cause problems for Apple over the next couple of quarters. And then again, I think the issue in developed markets is it's one of the saturation stories. So I know the bulls on the name are kind of hanging their hat on an iPhone 7 refresh, and I think they're looking back and saying, well, if you see what happened with iPhone 5S, we went to 6, we obviously saw a huge upgrade cycle, and then we went to 4S to 5, we saw a pretty big upgrade cycle. So I think the bulls are hanging their hat on the hopes that going from 6S to 7, we will see another big upgrade cycle in a strong December quarter. And I think there's a lot of concern that won't happen. And again, it kind of gets back to where we are in the smartphone cycle, where upgrades to phones are more evolutionary than revolutionary. And if you look at the levers that Apple pulled to drive those upgrade cycles in the past, I would argue that a good bit of that was screen size, because Apple was always behind competitors from a screen size perspective, and everyone who owned an iPhone really wanted a larger screen. And they pulled that lever and drove a lot of incremental sales. You can't make the phone much bigger now. So it'll be interesting to see what they come up with iPhone 7, but I think there's real risk that it's not going to drive the kind of upgrade cycles we've seen in previous iPhone refreshes.
I mean, I'm going to hold on to the 5 that I have. I mean, that's 6. I mean, I put it in my pocket. I mean, I'll break the thing. I mean, that's like it's like walking around with I'll get a tablet before I get that phone. But
Or it'll bend, right? Or it'll bend
I
on
will
you.
break. I have broken enough phones, so I don't want to go into that.
Yeah.
Last quarter, with the phones nearly 70% of total sales, you have some people making the argument that Apple is now more or less a one-trick pony. We saw what happened to the one-trick pony in GoPro and Fitbit. I mean, I'm not in any way making comparisons to those companies, but is that something concerning moving on down the line?
I mean, I think it is right now in the near term, right? Because because you've got some of the things that they're doing with the iWatch, and if you look at some of the reports and discounting we saw in the December quarter, that certainly suggests that perhaps that product hasn't performed as well as they'd hoped. There's been a lot of talk about them getting into the TV space, but due to challenges with negotiating agreements with with a lot of the content providers, I'm sure that's proven problematic to make that business case work and be effective. There's obviously been a lot of talk about the automotive space, and that seems like it's falling behind a little bit. And you don't really see Apple and any of the kind of the sizzle stuff at CES. Not that this is going to be a needle mover, but drones and virtual reality and home automation, you're just really not seeing them participate in a lot of that space. So, just because they're so incredibly dependent on the iPhone and they're really facing law of large numbers from a growth perspective, I think for the next, certainly for fiscal 16 and maybe into fiscal 17, it continues to be an iPhone story. And, with the headwinds that we've talked about, you can see why, the stock is trading the way it is, and investors are clearly growing concerned.
All right, so if they're not going to raise their dividend for now and they're not going to increase their buyback, what are they going to do with over $200 billion in cash? I mean, they've never really been a company to go out and make acquisitions. They did purchase Beats. I mean, they could, go buy Tesla without blinking an eye. I mean, do you think they're going to make any kind of acquisitions here in 2016?
Yeah, I think so. And you're right. I mean, historically under Steve Jobs acquisitions weren't really a part of or really wasn't their MO. And I think that Cook has shown an openness clearly to looking at acquisitions, and you obviously mentioned Beats. I mean, which I think proves that point. You hear a lot about Harman potentially buying something in Harman to get more exposure to the automotive space. I mean, maybe they're having a hard time figuring out how to make a drivetrain, but from a technology perspective and the brains of the car, you could see that it maybe as a first step into the automotive space that I could see potentially happening. Maybe they become a media company. I mean, look, they got enough money to do whatever they want, right? So, maybe they look at vertical integration, if you will, and acquire content and rights to it and so forth, and maybe that might help their prospects in getting into the living room in a more meaningful way. So I do think there are acquisitions out there that would make sense and complement their hardware business. And I quite honestly, I would expect it. I would expect there to be something in 2016. I mean, they're trying to change the narrative, if you will. It seems like it anyways, to be focusing more on their services business and talking about the growth in that business, which is a great business. I mean, $5.5 billion in revenue in the services business is great. But it's a small percentage still of their overall revenue of 76 billion last quarter. But they're trying to change the narrative, and I think they're trying to get people to think about, hey, there's a huge opportunity here to monetize our customer base of customers who have Apple products. But I just don't know that investors are going to really buy that in any meaningful way. So I do think that an acquisition is probably something that, or acquisitions that we're gonna probably see here in maybe the next 12 months or so.
I mean, there's been a couple rumors about GoPro. I mean, this company's just been decimated. Supposedly they're working on some drones and stuff. Do you see? I mean, I'm kicking the tires here in GoPro at all?
I don't know that they need to go buy GoPro. I don't think that. I mean, the brand is strong. I mean, the brand is really strong with GoPro, but I would argue that Apple can probably, build a strong brand around cameras. So I don't know that there's a lot there that they really need. I mean, I don't think there's really a lot of IP there that's going to really, force them to make an acquisition. I think that's probably something they can do on their own. I mean, they bought Beats, I would argue, because it is a strong brand and it gave them better access to music executives. And there's certainly some value in that. I'm just not so sure that there's much, beyond the brand that GoPro offers. So I would think that's probably something they could probably do on their own.
Right, they got the brand name. They don't need the GoPro name. The watch, you mentioned it briefly here. I mean, how did they do for estimates of sales and, from your estimates on sale of watches here? And also, do you think they'll, maybe going to make a further move into wearables?
The watch, I think, is, I think people might have gotten a little over their skis on the watch and how well that was going to do. I think the application for the product is interesting, but I think we need more applications to be able to increase the utility of the watch. So I guess longer term, as a category, I think it's exciting. I think that Apple will do well in that category, but for the stock and and looking for products to offset the softness in their core business, which is the iPhone, I'm just not convinced that the IoT market is going to, and even just beyond the watch, just the IoT market is obviously the buzzword nowadays. I mean, this is in its infancy right now, and there's a lot of issues from a communication standpoint that we need to get over before I think IoT really becomes a meaningful line of business for anybody. So I just don't. I think we're in the early innings here, and I just don't think it's going to be a meaningful contributor to earnings anytime soon.
Yeah, my first response was the watch is, I wear a watch. I'm a little bit older, but all these young guys that I work with, the younger people, they just don't seem to be wearing watches. If they want to know what time it is, they look on their phone. So, that's something that I just didn't have a lot of hope for. Going into, some other categories, you briefly mentioned virtual reality here. Is there anything is there any public or private companies that you think that Apple may be eyeing, or some innovations coming up from within the company itself?
Yeah, I mean, they were asked about it on the call last night, and Tim Cook thought it was an interesting category. He certainly didn't characterize it as he was asked as this sort of a niche-y kind of a thing. He thinks that there's, some interesting applications for that. So, yeah, I mean, I'm not aware of anything they're doing specifically, or companies or IP that they're looking at acquiring. I think there are some good companies that are doing, some startup companies that have some interesting products that I'm sure, might have caught their attention. And so, yeah, I wouldn't be surprised if we do eventually see them move into the VR space. But my sense is they're probably going to maybe take a more wait and see approach with this one and see how consumers respond and sort of the utility of the application and see what makes sense. So yeah, I think we'll probably see something, but here again, it's not going to be big enough to offset the weakness in the smartphone business. And again, from an investor perspective, I think we need to keep things in check and put things in perspective. And what can they really do as they face the law of large numbers to be able to offset what certainly seems like a weakening smartphone environment for them? And VR is nice and exciting. I just don't think it's going to be enough to move the needle.
What about maybe challenging Google here as far as the search engine goes? I mean, there's been rumors out there that there's been Apple bot or web crawler out there canvassing the internet, trying to amass information. With Siri, you have voice search. Do you see them making a run at Google at all as far as digging into part of that search and advertising market?
They from an advertising perspective, I mean, they would have to change, change how they do things, right? So they've always been an advocate of the customer. They've always wanted to protect information. They're not giving out credit card information or demographic information on Apple Pay. Obviously not credit card information, but any demographic information, or trying to monetize that information like Google. So I don't think so. I haven't really heard of anything, that would suggest that there's, for at least from the work that I've done, that there's something here. But Again, just thinking about Apple and how they're more pro-consumer and pro-customer and protecting information, whereas Google is the big evil company that likes to monetize all that stuff. I don't know, that would be a pretty big departure and an about-face to their culture, and I'm not so sure that they're prepared to do that, would be my sense.
If you were in Tim Cook's shoes and you were president and CEO of Apple, what would you do to improve the company's earnings or diversify its product base?
That's a great question. I think that in the smartphone space, they've always been hesitant to compete in the low end, and I understand that from a brand perspective, and I understand that from a margin perspective. But if there's truly a way to meaningfully monetize, I mean, if they're really trying to sell this whole services business in a way to monetize their customer base, then maybe there's an argument to be made that maybe it makes sense to sacrifice margins. And I don't think you're really going to tarnish the brand, because I think you can still make a great product and go after the low end of the segment. So you'll still keep your brand intact. You're probably going to sacrifice some gross margins, which people don't like. Clearly, we've seen that numerous times over. But if there's a way to begin to monetize the base, and if you can grow the base even bigger through going after different segments of the market, that might help. That certainly might help. I think it would be a multi-pronged approach without a doubt. I do think the automotive space is interesting. I don't think that going out and building a car might be the right strategy right now as a first step. But I think buying a Harman and getting more presence in the car from an infotainment perspective is pretty exciting, and I think could pay some dividends down the road. So those are some initial thoughts, but they're in a tough spot. I mean, they're a bit of a victim of their own success from a growth perspective. So it's not an easy situation they're in. And then from a stock standpoint, increasing the dividend, buying back shares, I would expect that the company's going to be under a lot of pressure from investors to do just that, given what we're seeing, what we saw last night, and what I think is going to be a few challenging quarters ahead of them.
And what's your current price target on Apple?
It's $120.
Okay, what would make you get off the Apple bandwagon here with, moving forward over the next couple quarters?
Get off the Apple bandwagon?
I mean, I'm not saying you're on the Apple bandwagon, but what would make you turn negative on the stock? Lower your price target or lower your recommendation on it.
Yeah, I mean, if we see, if we see another, we'll continue to do our work, but if we continue to see the demand environment softening, if we continue to hear about customers holding onto their phones longer because the phones are made better right now, and there's not a lot of incremental feature sets that are being brought out and so forth that are driving demand and increasing the upgrade cycle, and those kinds of things. And if the macro environment continues to be soft and oil stays low and all that kind of stuff, because stocks certainly be trading a lot with oil lately, that would get us even more bearish.
I sure wish they'd do something with the crystal, the glass on the phone, because I drop mine constantly and always have to replace the glass here. So maybe that's one potential innovation for the company. We've been on the line with Jeff Johnston. He's the managing director and wireless analyst at Detwiler, joining us here on Benzinga's PreMarket Prep. Jeff, thanks so much for your time. We really appreciate your input, and we'd certainly like to have you on again soon.
Great. My pleasure, guys. Thanks for your time as well. Have a good day.